All right, moving on into the middle period, the waking period, which lasts for 7 years of Friedrich's life and career. Here, though, to begin with, is his friend Georg Kersting's portrait of him in 1819 as a more or less domestic husband, in contrast with the image of him that we started with in the first video, with his very fiery gaze, his sort of storm and stress gaze. Here he looks like a domesticated husband, and indeed he married Carolina Bommer in 1818, which opened up this new epoch where the world opened up for him. Kersting was a pretty good artist, not bad. He's more or less a Friedrich imitator. He sort of takes the motif of the lone protagonist and runs with it, and that becomes his iconotype, his one iconotype. I like them very much, though, these lonely individuals in their studies, studying, reading, sewing in some cases. Here's another one. That's Kersting. He had another friend, C.G. Carus, Carl Gustav Carus, who was also a writer and philosopher who wrote a book called Psyche, which influenced Carl Jung, actually. But I think he was a very weak painter. His sight with some of his Friedrich imitations, they're not very good. They're kind of stiff and very awkward, and they're just not convincing. That one even looks impressionistic. So that's another one of his influences. He had a very strong influence, though, on the Hudson River Valley school of painters, an extremely strong influence. Okay, so then, beginning with, here is Carolina, and he paints her in a number of paintings, quite a few of them actually, but always with her back turned. And this is a painting that was painted in 1818 called Woman Before the Rising Sun. And so now the sun is rising. We're done with sunsets and twilights for the time being, and now the sun is rising in Friedrich's life. He has a new wife, and her sister comes and hangs out. Her brother comes and hangs out. He apparently likes them quite a bit because he puts them in a number of paintings. And so the human type now shifts from, as we have seen, it started in subphase 1, where there were practically no people whatsoever in his sketches and drawings from that first 7-year period. And then in subphases 2 and 3, the lone protagonist comes in, which we have seen Kersting take over here. And now in this middle period, it's the jovial human assemblage, let's say, to borrow a term from Deleuze and Guattari. Individuals are rarely represented by themselves. And so the dawn, and so let's take a look. This is a portrait painted from his honeymoon on the island of Ravine. And the date, I believe, is 1819 for this. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, 1818 actually. The chalk cliffs at Ravine, and it's interesting because so here we have now. Once again, they're characters now. They're actual humans inhabiting the painting, but they all have their backs turned to us. This is most likely Friedrich, and he always represents himself in archaic German dress for some reason. And here's Carolina over here gesturing down at something that this individual, who might be her brother-in-law, I'm sure it's one of the family members who has accompanied them to the island, is looking down into the abyss. Friedrich characteristically is staring off, and some art critics have suggested even that this is painted in the shape of a heart. This little love grotto here, which is possible, but it might be one of those unconscious things that artists sometimes do. But the significance with regard to the shift from dreaming to waking is that here we're still in a kind of cavern. It's almost as though he has painted this to look like the mouth of a cave, and we're transitioning now from the cave out into the bright daylight of his life. And so indeed he's often sailing with his wife. This is on the sailing boat of 1819. Who knows where they're headed, but they're happy. And there's a third person, obviously. Somebody is steering the boat. That's you, the viewer, whoever that person is. And this painting influenced Manet's painting, Boating, from the late 1860s, maybe early 1870s. And notice that Manet has eliminated the horizon line to create a sense of a bit of disorientation in the viewer here. It's a great painting. And then so now let's take a look here at so now he does paint a series of paintings of individuals, and they're always together. There's always more than one individual. The lone protagonist is gone, is not here, and actually will not reappear, since in the final period there are no protagonists whatsoever. So this is Two Men Contemplating the Moon from 1819. That might be his brother-in-law leaning cheerfully with his arm on his shoulder. They look like they're having fun. Not really a gloomy motif at all in the painting here. And then here we have the series of paintings that he did regarding the day. This is from 1822. This is the morning of 1822. So it's a sunrise now. Notice that he's interested in the dawn. And then here is midday, or right around noon. Notice what he does with the trees here. There's a clump of trees. Individuals are out going about doing their business, what Heidegger would call being Daseins, with a pre-philosophical understanding of what it is that they're supposed to be doing, and they're just already up and running doing it by the time we encounter them. And there's lots of space to either side of the trees here at noon, but with afternoon, notice that the trees are encroaching. They're creeping in. So he can't resist, even in his optimistic, jovial phase, doing something a little creepy. He's always thinking that way. So the trees are encroaching, and this is noon. And then finally, we have, that one's out of place there, evening. So there's a rare painting of the evening here. The trees have encroached and created a complete line here with two protagonists walking along. It's not particularly brooding or ominous, though. And then the one that we missed here is very important because it's one of his most famous and probably his most iconic painting, Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog from 1818. And so now note what he's done here is that we saw the ascendance of the crucifix, the signifier of the cross, ascend up the mountain to Risengeberga, morning at Risengeberga, where it achieved its apotheosis. And so now he puts a human protagonist, which might even be Friedrich himself, in place of the crucifix. And now it's quite awake. It's in harsh, broad daylight. It looks like noon to me. He's very much out of the cave. We've come out of the cave from the chalk cliffs at Rügen, and he's boldly strode forth to survey the summit of the world. And of course, this is also a Faustian archetype that goes back to Petrarch's ascent of Mount Ventoux, and Nietzsche's ascent also up a mountain at the beginning of Thus Spake Zarathustra, with the character there, and I believe in Byron's poem Manfred, which is a kind of Faust poem. The character also ascends a mountain and looks out. This is the Faustian infinite space, and here he does use depth perspective. He retrieves it. Although it's interesting, though, he kind of disguises it with this sea of fog here and these planes. You get a second plane here and a third plane here, and finally a far plane. But it is perspectival, and it is the Faustian myth of infinite space that he's captured in this, one of his best, probably one of his 5 best paintings. It's absolutely, it's exhilarating just to look at it, the energy that it shows there. Okay, and then so here's another sunny, cheerful painting that I like. Meadow at the town of Greifswald, where he was from. That's where he lived most of his life, in Greifswald. And we've got, instead of people, we've got horses out together, gamboling, enjoying themselves, sunning themselves on the grass. He hardly ever paints animals at all. It's extremely rare for him. But during this extroverted exhalation phase of his art, he is very much jovial and interested in the outer world. Even though a friend of his was murdered, an academic professor, Kugelgain was his last name, who was murdered one night in 1820 while out for a walk. Just murdered, I guess robbed and beaten, and it really upset him. But even so, that was 1820, and this period lasts down to 1825 before it gets dark again. He still manages to maintain a sense of cheerfulness, even in spite of that murder that really upset him. And this painting dates from 1822. And okay then, and so moving along, here's another very bright daytime sunny painting. It's called Village Landscape in Morning Light. Not Village Landscape at sunset or twilight, in morning light. There's a bit of darkness in the foreground, implying that a shadow has crossed over the sun. But there's lots of sunlight here, lots of free open space, and an interesting oak tree here that's in the center. He likes oak trees, but oak trees are dying and reviving trees. They're not evergreens. And so it matters what tree that he decides to paint. And we'll look at an oak tree in his final gloomy phase that is quite sinister, stripped completely of all life on it. Here there's cheerful life. The leaves are drowsing, photosynthesizing, and enjoying grazing on sunlight. I think it's a very cheerful painting. And then here we have another one of his moonrise paintings, or people just watching the moon in the sky. This is Moonrise by the Sea of the same year, 1822. But it's not the lone protagonist. It's the moon is rising, a couple of boats floating almost like ghosts out on the waters, and possibly Friedrich here with his wife and her sister, having fun, enjoying themselves, looking out. It's not a gloomy painting at all. And then here's another landscape that's quite a beautiful landscape, which is also from that same year, 1822, and on into possibly 1823, Rocky Ravine. So it's another brightly lit landscape, very beautiful. Bringing in a little bit more, very beautiful, very sunny. Also, like the village with the tree, has a sort of dark foreground and then a bright vista in the distance, drawing the eye outward towards it and away from the darkness. That's the key thing. With the chalk cliffs at Rugen, there was a dark foreground as well, but the viewer's gaze was forced out to the background, to the ocean. Same thing with the tree that we just looked at, the lone tree with the cloud going over it, and the bright background. Same thing here. The darkness is being, temporarily anyway, cast off, shoved aside, and moved out of Friedrich's way here as he exists in this waking daylight consciousness phase of his life for 7 years. And then we get in 1824, this is a different temper now. This is 1824, this period, the last period, when he returns back to the gloomy phase of the night and the abyss, graveyards, death, and paintings with no people in them. This is the first of those in 1824. And it's one of his most famous and one of his best, The Sea of Ice. And we see that the ice has crushed very possibly one of these ships that was looking for the Northwest Passage that the British were sending out quite a bit near the Arctic. And we can see poles here that's been crushed and cracked apart. No people anywhere, and the absolute victory of nature over civilization. This whole thing casts scorn on civilization. And so already we see just a year ahead of the change here, the last 15 years of his life, from 1825 to 1840, when the gloomy abyssal dream world returns. And so I do want to remark too that the total of all these years from 1797, when, as we saw, that he first started painting, going all the way down to the end of his life in 1840. He has a stroke in 1835 that renders him incapable of oil painting for the last 5 years of his life, but he did do a lot of watercolors and sepia painting. That whole period from 23 years of age to 65 is a period of 42 years, which is to say half the cycle of the planet Uranus. Uranus is the planet that is associated with breakthroughs and achievements. This is why most people at the noon of life, which is to say 40 years old, have great achievements. All philosophers write their best books, almost all of them write their best books between the ages of 38 and 44, something like that, early 40s, late 30s. And so Friedrich's entire career can be regarded as a home run. The whole thing, even though he falls out of favor in these later years as we move into them, he was no longer famous, especially in the last gloomy period, when he could hardly interest anyone in his art anymore. But this is 42 years. That's Uranus opposite Uranus. It takes 84 years to go around the sun. And so that the whole career can be sort of sandwiched in between Uranus from where it was when he was 23 to where it ended up when he died at the age of 65. It was 42 years. All right, so that's it. And one more video on his final period when he returns back to the dream world.